Slider sheet demonstration. Slider sheets act as a friction reduction device during resident bed and chair positioning tasks. The sheets operate as a pair. One side of each sheet is lined with handles for ease of maneuverability. Meet Caregiver 1, Doris. Meet Caregiver 2, Wanda. And our resident, Barb. Prior to any positioning task, ensure the slider sheets are intact and handles are not frayed or loose. Ensure the positioning task corresponds to the logo and instructions provided on the resident's care guide. The following demonstration will review the Arjo slider fold technique and removal. This method can be used when the resident is obtuse in the midsection and is unable to roll, or when medical status may be compromised with rolling, or if the resident has a compromised muscle tone. Caregivers stand on opposite sides of the bed. Caregivers take 2 slider sheets and hold them back to back with the handles on the outside. Doris will pass the slider sheets to her partner on the opposite side of the bed. The slider sheets will now be folded into 4 to 6 inch folds. Note that each fold is about the length of a hand. Ensure that at least 2 inches of the sheet are left unfolded at the end. Position the slider sheets with the thick fold against the bed surface and the thin open flaps towards the head of the bed on top. It is recommended that the slider is positioned at the resident's head and unraveled downwards, as this follows the direction of the resident's clothes and helps to prevent sheets from getting caught. Always ensure that the bed brakes are on and the bed position is placed at the caregiver's hips. Note that the taller caregiver might have to adjust their height by bending their knees in order to meet the bed surface. Body positioning is critical when unraveling a slider sheet from the head of the bed towards the foot of the bed. Caregivers stand with one foot in front of the other in walk stance. The slider sheets are going to be unfurled by shifting the weight from the front leg to the back leg. The thin flap is grasped by the outside hand. The inside arm is going to be palm up, will slide against the bed surface and grasp the bulk of the folds. It is important to note that the body moves as one unified unit during this motion. Note that the caregiver's elbows will be glued at their sides. In order to unravel the slider sheet, caregivers count together in order to move together to unravel the sliders.
1, 2, 3.
Note that the slider sheet is only unraveled during the weight shift, and that the contact of the arm is not left the bed surface.
1, 2, 3.
Once at the hip area, caregivers might opt to unravel one at a time, as there might be increased resistance.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
The slider sheets are now positioned for any other bed positioning task. Once the slider sheet is unfurled, it is now in position in order for caregivers to maneuver the resident up or down in bed. In order to maneuver a resident down in bed, ensure that a pillow is placed at the resident's feet or at the head, depending on which direction you're moving the resident. Caregivers stand on either side of the resident's bed with a wide base, feet apart, toes pointing towards the bed. Caregivers bend their knees and lean back slightly as they grasp the slider sheets. Slider sheets can be grasped with the palms down or can be grasped with a thumbs up fist position to ensure extra securability. In order to maneuver resident to the foot of the bed, caregivers shift their weight from the foot closest to the head of the bed to their foot closest to the foot of the bed. Note that elbows should be at the caregiver's sides during this task. On the count of 3, caregivers shift their weight and only move the resident as far as their weight shift allows.
1, 2, 3.
Repeat this position as necessary until the resident is in the desired position. Once a resident has been correctly positioned, you can remove the slider sheets. Slider sheets can be removed by passing the corner of the sheets nearest to the foot of the resident's bed to the second caregiver. Doris will fold under the slider sheet, folding it under itself, and will pass the corner to Wanda, who's waiting on the opposite side. Wanda reaches for the corner and, grasping only those slider sheet corners, will begin to pull the slider sheet out hand over hand, walking at a 45-degree angle away from the bed. Always ensure that slider sheets are removed after a positioning task. Positioning a slider sheet using the tuck procedure. This procedure can be used for residents who are able to assist with turning. Adjust the bed height as appropriate and cue the resident to turn over on her side. Use the side rail if appropriate and cue the resident to hold onto the side rail in order to turn. Once the resident is turned over, slider sheets are placed back to back and are tucked underneath the resident. Once the sheets are tucked underneath the resident is cued to turn over, where now the caregiver on the opposite side reaches over and pulls the slider sheets taut. The resident is now set up so that they can be continued to move in any bed positioning task. In order to turn this resident onto their side, one caregiver stands on opposite sides of the bed. In order for the resident to turn towards Wanda, our second caregiver, both caregivers are in walk stance, one foot in front of the other, knees bent. Doris, caregiver 1, grasps the resident at the hip and at the shoulder in order to guide the resident during the slide across the bed. Wanda grasps the slider handles at the shoulder and at the hip of the resident, palms down or in the fist up position, feet in walk stance, one foot in front of the other. On the count of 3, Wanda is going to pull only the top slider sheet while Doris pushes and guides the resident to the edge of the bed.
1, 2, 3.
Once at the edge of the bed, the resident can be set up in preparation for the turn. For example, legs might be crossed. A pillow can be placed on the opposite side of the bed if 2 caregivers are required for the turn. Otherwise, caregivers remain on opposite side of the bed in preparation for the turn. During the turn, caregiver 1, Doris, is going to be guiding the resident using her 2 hands and placing them at the resident's shoulders and at the resident's hip in order to guide the resident towards the peak of the turn. Wanda is going to be using her body mechanics to shift her weight from her front foot to her back foot to her front foot again in order to rock, and use her body mechanics to lift the resident up and over in order to turn the resident. Once the resident's at the peak of the turn, Doris can stabilize the resident and we can reposition using pillows, etc. until the resident is comfortable. But once again, ensure slider sheets are removed once the positioning task has been completed. The next positioning task will be the insertion of a sling for a resident who is unable to turn on their own. In order to insert a sling, ensure slider sheets have been positioned underneath the resident using the previous positioning task, either the tuck procedure or the furl procedure. Caregivers stand on opposite side of the bed. Position the sling so that it is at the resident's coccyx. Use the support straps to pass underneath the hollow of the resident's body. You'll notice that there are natural hollows in the body under the ankles, under the knees, under the small of the back, and under the neck. We're going to be pulling the leg support and the straps in between the neck region and the knee region. The sling is lined up in between the slider sheets. Caregivers pass the straps to the opposite caregiver. Prior to the sling being pulled taut underneath the resident in between the sheets, ensure that there are no bumps and that it is smoothly positioned on the side of the bed. Caregivers stand with one foot in front of the other. Doris, on the opposite side of the bed, is going to be shifting her weight from her front foot to her back foot as she pulls the sling bit by bit in between the two slider sheets. The caregiver on the opposite side will secure the slider sheets by holding them tautly securely together. On the count of 3, the sling will begin to be positioned in between the sheets. Once in between the slider sheets, the sling can be positioned as needed in between the sheets in order to ensure that the sling is positioned underneath the resident's coccyx area. Prior to the resident being transported via mechanical lift, the top slider sheet must be removed. In order to remove the slider sheet, one caregiver passes the corner of a slider sheet under itself towards the resident underneath the hollows of the ankle. Caregiver then pulls the slider sheet at a 45-degree angle away from the bed. The resident now can be connected to the mechanical lift and the transfer completed. In order to remove a sling from a resident who has been lowered into a bed using mechanical lift, first position one slider sheet onto the bed. The resident then would be lowered onto the bed using the mechanical lift. The lift would be disconnected and the sling would be left underneath the resident's body. In order to remove the sling from the body, take one slider sheet, drape it across the resident's leg, and begin to fold the slider sheet into 4 to 6 inch folds. Again, about the length of a hand. Ensure that a few inches of material are left unrolled at the top of the slider sheet. In order to position this slider sheet, fold it over with the thick roll on the bottom against the bed surface and the thin flap at the top. Lift the resident's head and tuck the slider sheet in between the sling and the resident's shoulder blades. This will anchor the slider sheet. In order to unfurl this slider sheet along the length of the bed, position yourself facing in the opposite direction that the slider sheet will be unfurled, 1 foot in front of the other. The outside hand will be securing the thin flap at the top. Remember, since you will be unfurling the slider sheet along with the sling, you'll need to secure the sling during the unfurling process. Caregiver's inside arm will be palm up. Caregivers will bend at their knees to ensure that forearms are against the bed surface. Using the palms up position, caregivers will grab the bulk of the folds, and on the count of 3, while securing the sling with their outside hand, they will begin to unfurl the slider sheet along the length of the resident's body. 1, 2, 3. Caregivers shift their weight and begin to unfurl the slider. When caregivers reach the hip region, you might find some resistance. It might be an opportunity now for caregivers to take a turn unraveling one caregiver at a time.
So 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Once the slider has been completely unfurled underneath the resident, it is now in position in order to remove the sling. In order to remove the sling, caregivers grasp the sling from underneath the resident. Place a pillow near the resident's head and begin to pull the slider sheet by shifting your weight from your back foot to your front foot towards the head of the bed. Ensure you're securing the top sheet as you remove the sling. Once the sling has been removed, make sure to guard the resident's head and gently guide them towards the bed surface. Again, in order to remove these slider sheets, both sheets can be removed by tucking the corners underneath themselves and passing to your partner. Slider sheets must always be removed after each positioning task. For residents who are able to maneuver themselves in bed, one slider sheet can be used to ease the transition in order to reduce the friction required during the task. Take one slider sheet and fold it in half. You will not be using the handles for this process, so you can fold it with the handles on the inside and the shear side on the outside. Position the slider sheet so that the open flaps are towards the resident's feet. Ask the resident to turn onto her side. Lift the side rail and cue the resident to turn over. Once the resident is on her side, tuck the slider sheet underneath the resident's shoulder blades. Cue the resident to roll back while second caregiver pulls the slider sheet's top. Cue the resident to bend her legs with heels against the bed surface. Ask the resident to hug her body. Cue the resident to lift her head and try to look at her toes as you cue her to push with her heels against the bed surface and slide to the top of the bed. Please note that caregivers are simply cueing and guiding during this maneuver, and the resident is performing the bulk of the work. Once again, a slider sheet must be removed after each positioning task. If the resident is able to turn on her side, we can ask her to turn. And tuck the slider sheets underneath itself. And second caregiver can remove the slider sheets. sling insertion and removal using a slider sheet. Use this task for residents who will not lean forward or it is difficult for them to lean forward. Take one slider sheet. Fold the slider sheet in half. The handles can be on the inside. Starting with the folded edge, one caregiver grabs the corner of the folded edge and passes it to the second caregiver who is standing on the opposite side of the chair. Caregivers must secure the top and bottom corners of the slider sheet. In order to begin this maneuver, tuck the corners behind the resident's shoulders in order to secure the sheets. On the count of 3, caregivers will bend their knees as they position their sheet behind the resident's body. If applicable, you can remove the armrests for ease of maneuverability. On a specified count, caregivers will use their body mechanics to bend their knees as they pull the slider sheet towards the base of the chair. Once at the base, perform a side-to-side zigzag motion in order to ensure the slider is at the base of the chair. Once positioned, take care to ensure that the slider sheet is positioned around the shoulders of the resident in order to prepare for the sling insertion. The sling will be inserted in between the slider and the chair surface. Caregivers hold the base of the sling and pass one corner to each other. Secure the sling behind the resident's shoulders in the chair. Once secured, caregivers must ensure that the slider is secured as they pull the sling down to the base of the chair. Using the same body mechanics by bending their legs, caregivers on a specified count pull the sling to the base of the chair. Once at the base of the chair, caregivers can zigzag the sling back and forth to ensure that it is at the base of the resident's coccyx. Please note, slider sheets must be removed. In order to remove a slider sheet, caregivers simply pull the slider sheet up and out of the chair. The resident is now positioned in order to be connected to the mechanical lift. Always ensure that a sling is removed once it is not being used. An option for positioning the leg supports include using the slider sheet in order to position the sling underneath the resident's legs. Wrap the slider around the resident's leg. Caregiver 1 passes the leg support to caregiver 2. Caregiver 2 stands and pulls the leg support up in between the resident's legs. The slider sheet is then removed, and the same procedure is followed for the opposite leg. Caregiver wraps the slider around the resident's legs. The other caregiver secures the slider while the leg support is pulled taut. Remove the slider sheet simply by pulling it away from the leg. The mechanical lift can now be connected. The sling must be removed from behind the resident. In order to remove the leg supports, fold the leg supports underneath themselves until they are clear of the resident. Bring the leg supports towards the back of the chair. Using one slider sheet, fold it in half. With the handles on the inside. Leading with the folded edge, secure the slider in between the resident's body and the sling. Once secured, ensure that the outside hand is securing the sling as well as the slider sheet while the inside hand pulls the slider along the length of the chair surface towards the base of the resident's body. Bending their legs, caregivers pull the slider to the base of the chair. Once positioned, caregivers can simply stand on opposite sides of the resident and pull the sling out from behind the chair. Chair repositioning tasks using a single slider sheet. For residents who are slouched forward in a wheelchair or alternative seating surface, take one slider sheet and fold it in half. Handles can be on the inside. Starting with the folded edge, begin folding the slider sheet into 4 to 6 inch folds. Ensure that some slider sheet is not unraveled at the end. When assessing the resident's situation, determine whether you can remove the armrests in order to perform this task. If it's safe to do so, remove the armrests as well as the leg rests. Ensure that the brakes of the wheelchair are on. If the resident is able to do so, request that he or she lean forward. Position the fold of the slider sheet against the seating surface of the chair so that the thin flap is facing the back of the chair rest. Caregivers pass the slider sheet to each other and, ensuring that they bend their legs, secure the slider sheet at the resident's coccyx area. Caregivers' inside hand grasps the bulk of the folds of the sheet. The outside hand secures the open folds of the sheet. In order to unravel this sheet under the resident, caregivers must be careful to ensure that their legs are guarding the resident's legs to prevent the resident from sliding further out of the chair. Caregivers count to 3 as they begin to unfurl the slider sheet underneath the resident.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
Once the slider sheet has been unraveled underneath the resident, again, care must be taken to ensure that residents are guarding the front of the resident's legs. One caregiver moves to the front of the resident's legs in order to guard the resident's body to prevent the resident from sliding out of the chair. The second caregiver will then cue the resident to lean forward as the caregiver guides the resident's legs back to the back of the chair. Once the resident is positioned at the back of the wheelchair, both caregivers return to the front of the chair. Caregivers take the slider sheet and fold it underneath itself. A second option would be to have one caregiver remain at the front of the resident while the second caregiver removes the slider sheet on both sides. On the count of 3, caregivers begin to pull the slider sheet towards the back of the resident's chair. Once at the resident's hips, caregivers can begin to remove the slider sheet from underneath the resident's bottom and remove it from the chair. Second option for slider removal during a chair repositioning task. One caregiver positions themselves at the front of the resident in order to secure the resident's legs. The second caregiver stands on one side of the chair, grasps the slider sheets, and begins to fold the slider sheets underneath itself. Once the slider sheet is folded underneath itself, the caregiver can begin to pull the slider sheet towards the back of the chair. The caregiver must then alternate sides and perform the same procedure on the opposite side. Continue this procedure until the slider sheet has been safely removed from the resident's chair surface.